Hello, my name is David Schlossberg, and our topic in this educational video is to review the concepts behind diversification and proper portfolio development. I live in the Chicago suburbs, and I literally dread the day that I might have to drive to the city during rush hour. Many of you have experienced rush hours to various degrees throughout our country. If you drive anything like me, when you're going along in your lane and it stops, what do? Well, if you're like me, you move over into an adjoining lane. And as soon as you do that, what happens? Well, maybe it's just Chicago, but it seems that without fail that when I change lanes, the new lane I just changed into stops, and the one that I left is now moving again. Now, I know it's not just me. That's our nature. We long to get ahead. But now, how many of us do our investing that way? We look for the hot investment, maybe read about it in an article, and as soon as we move into it, it stops leaping forward. I know in Chicago I would prefer if there were 10 lanes into the city. But even better than that, what if there were an 11th lane that hovered over the top and guaranteed to provide the average speed of the 10 lanes below? How many of us would prefer to be in that 11th lane? Well, that's a very simplistic view of diversification. Rather than be at the whim of or stuck with the results of a singular particular lane or a particular singular investment, wouldn't we be happy with the outcome when spread amongst various lanes or various investments? Not to mention the peace of mind that comes from that. Likely our results would be more consistent, reducing investment risk. In addition to reducing risk, we may very well see better overall results. And to illustrate that point, I'd like us to take what I refer to as a blindfold preference test. Before we do this step, I strongly recommend that you view the educational piece called Defining Standard Deviation, the first step to understanding risk statistics, as we'll be utilizing that statistic, standard deviation, within these slides. Okay, on our first slide, we see a whole bunch of colorful symbols. These symbols represent various investments that we'll be taking a look at. On the bottom axis, we see standard deviation. And if you remember from that class, the higher the number, the larger the roller coaster, or in other words, the larger the variance of returns and therefore risk. On the left axis, we see return. Without the need for much explanation, the higher you go, the greater the investment return was. So understanding risk the way we do, it would be fair to say that we'd like to be as far left as we can get and as high as we can get. Greater returns, less risk, right? On the next slide, I've taken away some clutter, and I have a simple question. The 4 circles represent an investment, and the 6 triangles represent investments. You are depositing some money, and you have a choice between a circle or a triangle. However, which circle or which triangle you wind up with is randomly selected. You can only choose between a circle or a triangle. Given that question, which would you choose? So let's take a look at that. It seems to me that 5 of the 6 triangles have less risk than 3/4 or most of the circles. It also seems that 5 of the 6 have better returns than half the circles. Given the likelihoods of the random selection, I would choose a triangle. Wouldn't you agree? So if we take this one step farther, though, we now have a choice between the results of a triangle or the results of a starburst. Again, you can only receive one randomly. You get to choose the shape, but the result is going to be random for you within those shapes. If the goal is to get farthest upwards and to the left, it might appear as if the triangles have a good shot. But if I look at this closer, if I choose a starburst, I have a 75% chance at significantly outperforming half of the triangles. I would choose the starburst as there would appear to be a greater likelihood of getting my desired results. Okay, so the last choice is here. The choice is randomly getting one of the 4 starbursts or getting the square. I think most of us would choose the square. It represents less risk, while a return that's at least as large as 3/4 of the starburst. So what does all this mean? This time I've added a legend on the right side of the screen. The circles represent 4 different indexes. The blue circle, otherwise known as A, represents the standard deviation and return of the S&P 500 over the past 10 years. That is the beginning of August 2001 through the end of July 2011. The return during that period of time was 2.61, with a standard deviation just under 16%. The dark mustard color represents the MSCI EFA index, which is basically developed international stocks. EFA is an acronym for Europe, Asia, and the Far East. It had better results than the S&P, with a return just over 6%, but was also more volatile or riskier. The brown circle represents global real estate investment trust. While that can represent anything in the real estate arena, generally speaking, you can think of it as investments and ownership in things similar to Willis Towers in downtown Chicago or the Mall of America in Minneapolis. Most would be surprised that it represented that decade well, at over a 10% return, but also as expected over the last decade, it suffered through a lot of volatility and a high standard deviation. The last circle, the purple one, represents a precious metal index. That would be many metals, not just gold, so it could include items such as silver, titanium, iron ore, and the like. The return for the decade was phenomenal at just under 20% per year. That's when a crystal ball would come in handy. So what is the hot investment category for the next decade? Of course, we don't know for sure. Just like we don't know which lane on the highway is going to perform the best. We might have a hunch, but nothing is certain, which is why you find folks like me jumping from lane to lane and wishing there were an 11th lane hovering overhead. So we diversify to increase the likelihood of success in reaching our goal, or just to provide some peace of mind. On the same slide, the triangles represent 50-50 mixes of the 4 investment choices. So the yellow triangle, labeled as AB, is a 50-50 blend between A, the S&P 500, and B, the International Fund. And the AD triangle, which is light blue, represents a 50-50 mix between the A and D indexes, which is the S&P 500 and global real estate. Looking at the position of those two compared to the respective circles, you see the results that one might logically expect, somewhere between the two, both in terms of risk or volatility as well as returns. But sometimes the results are much better than expected. Look at the position of the peach triangle and then look to discover its makeup. The peach triangle represents a 50-50 mix of the B and C funds. The return is greater than the halfway mark between the two, but the standard deviation by the blend, or the risk, is clearly less than either of the funds individually. This is the result of using funds that are not correlated to each other. While using correlations to build effective portfolios is another class, the takeaway for this class is that if we have blended 2 different funds together that react to the market cycles differently, and then the result is a better than average result with reduced overall risk. One of the other takeaways of this example is that for those few that do look at risk statistics, often they will look at the risk metrics for each investment. But what really matters is the risk metrics of the portfolio as a whole, as you can reduce risk by blending different types of assets together. Moving forward in this blindfold study, we see that the starbursts represent 1/3 in each of the 3 individual indexes. If you recall, I elected starbursts over triangle, and hopefully you did as well. The further we blend our investments, the greater the likelihood of reducing risk. Lastly, when we look at the square compared to the 4 investment choices, we see it does better than or equals the return of 3/4 of the individual investments, but has less risk. This square represents a 25% allocation in each of the 4 indexes. The returns table shows the results of each over the 3-year and 10-year period ending August 2011. Here's an interesting item to note. Looking at the result of ABD over the past 3 years, we see that mixture over 3 years would have resulted in a bit over a 9% return. But go to the top of the table and look at the individual results for A, B, and D over the same 3-year period. None of the 3 have exceeded 3.5% during that same time period, but a third in each generated over a 9% return. This is another example of why correlations are so important, and again will be discussed in the correlations lesson. Obviously, so we didn't get to overwhelm you with data, this is just an example of diversifying amongst 4 different asset classes. In reality, we should be diversifying among 10 or more asset classes, hence my 10 lanes into Chicago. Now that we've taken a simplistic view, how about we take it a step further? If we have our 10 lanes into Chicago, can we do some statistical analysis to determine which lanes typically perform better? Of course so. With that in mind, what does better mean to you? When talking about driving, to some, it will mean a faster average speed. To others, it'll mean more consistency. And yet again, to others that are safety first, it would mean less accidents. With this information, if we can build the 11th lane any way we want it to be, perhaps rather than give an equal 10% weighting to each lane, we can adjust some sliders and apply perhaps a 15% weighting to this lane and only a 5% weighting to the other lane. In other words, now that we have lots of lanes or investment choices, we can weight up and weight down certain positions to meet our objectives. From the blindfold preference test, we can see that not only can proper diversification, also known as asset allocation, provide us with less risk, we can also see improved overall results. Because of risk, many investors run to cash when the market is unstable. With cash paying less than 0.5% these days, that is like trying to beat the traffic by riding a tricycle on the shoulder. You've reduced risk, but truthfully, you won't be going very far. There are better methods to reduce risk, and hopefully these classes will keep you involved, waiting for traffic to move again. I'm David Schlossberg. Thank you for joining me. Until the next class.